Super excited to be here today to present for you. We were just talking about this a moment ago. It's been a while since we presented together.
I know, like easily 2-3 years ago. And
yeah, exactly.
He kind of lost his ways in product management, and now he's kind of coming back.
Right.
To the
Yeah. I did my own thing for a while doing. So I've been at VMware for. Okay, fact check me because you joined a month after me. So 13 years. 14?
Almost 15, buddy.
15, wow, well, that long. Okay, so yeah, William and I started at VMware at the same time, so we used to share an office, actually. So I've been doing a number of different things, worked in technical marketing, moved over to product management, went into the office of the CTO and did some stuff. You might have seen me on stage with Pat in a VR headset. At one point, we were doing some fun stuff around managing virtual and augmented reality devices through Workspace ONE. And then now I'm back in the VCF area, working with William again. So back home, and it's going good. So William,
cool. You want to switch the slides? There we go. Okay, my name is William Lam. I'm a distinguished engineer at Broadcom. Like Alan said, coming up almost 15 years now. I run a personal blog, and you guys can always reach out to me on a number of different platforms.
Yeah. Do you even need to put your blog on your intro? Does anybody not know where William's blog is? Has anybody not got a bookmark for William's blog? Yeah, see, no hands went up then. Okay, so we're here today to talk about minimal deployments of VCF. I mean, you've seen VCF this week, right? I mean, who hasn't seen VCF 9 this week? It should be in your blood by now. I mean, William, walk over here for a second, will you? Look at the t-shirt. Right. Look at the shoes. Lift your
basically
lift
walking.
Look at the socks.
Oh, hold up! I got some underwear too.
I mean, this guy's drinking the Kool-Aid right now. Hopefully, you are all too. I mean, let's get real. It's excited to see VCF 9. To be honest with you, I feel like we're really coming together. We're bringing everything back together, integrating it all together. Finally, William and I have been in the background, kind of scripting all this stuff and automating it, and bringing all of that automation and kind of bringing all of that back into the UI and actually treating it like a single product is what I think by far the biggest thing in VCF 9 is. So I'm super excited about that. But you're all here today to work out, like, how do I get started with this? What are the use cases? How can I do a minimal deployment, I guess? So let's take a look at why I think you're in the room, but maybe you can correct me. So when it comes to a minimal deployment, what we generally see is there's kind of 3 different areas. So the first one might be learning and testing. How many of you are here just to understand what is the smallest thing I can deploy to get this up and running and start learning and testing things out? So a good kind of 70-80% of you. Okay, what about automation? So, William, you ever written a script and run it straight in production?
All the time.
No? Not the correct answer. You should, of course, run your scripts in test and dev environments, develop your scripts in test and dev environments, all of your automation scripts, VCFA, all of those kind of things. You really want to do it in a secure and not an environment that is production, because whilst you can do automation in production, believe me, when you do automation and you accidentally delete something, you can delete in mass as well. So not a good idea in production. And then obviously Edge is kind of a minimal deployment as well. So what about automation? Who's here to kind of say, yeah, I want to set up a separate environment? Okay. And then Edge. Okay, great. What am I missing? Is there another reason you might want a smaller deployment? Home labs? Okay. Yeah, I kind of count that under the learning and testing because I know it's your own time and it's your home lab, but you're still learning from that home lab. I don't know, maybe not. Maybe you have a full production environment at home and you're providing services to your wife and kids, or your partner and your kids, I don't know.
Somebody got to do that streaming service.
I literally do that actually with Home Assistant, so yeah. Vehicle-based solutions, okay. So really small environments in vehicles. Okay, great. Yeah, I guess kind of edge-ish, maybe.
Yeah, it's disconnected.
Right, so the disconnected part of the edge. Yeah, the comment was, yeah, it could be edge, but it's disconnected most of the time, and then sometimes it comes back online. Gotcha, thank you. Any other things that I haven't thought about on here? Okay, good, great, thank you. So Hopefully you've understood by now where we are with VCF 5, and what we want to do is bring you up to date with VCF 9 and what you can do to get that minimal deployment, no matter what your use case is. So with VCF 5, you're probably familiar with what the minimal deployment looked like there. We are talking about 3 NSX managers. We're talking about a vCenter server, an SDDC manager, all in your management domain. And then you can install things like ARIA Identity Manager, ARIA Automation, and Ops for logs. All of these are built out through the VCF Cloud Builder, but let's face it, VCF Cloud Builder was a pretty big thing to download. Anybody have any issues with Cloud Builder itself and the actual downloading of it and size of it? I heard a yes. Do you want to raise your hands if you do?
Don't be shy.
Yeah.
There may or may not be a product manager in here that he shall not be named. But if you look at the screen, right, like we were very rigid. You needed to have 4 physical hosts. You had to use vSAN. You had to have 2 dual 10 gigabit NICs, right? So a lot of these requirements, and it may or may not be easy to meet in terms of a dev, home lab type of production environment. Were any of these challenges for you in the past for those who are deploying? Yeah, I saw you load and eyes hands.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the place that I always fall over is that network switch as well, and having those VLANs. So I know that's quite a common one. Okay, yeah, and like William said, you had to have vSAN, you had to have those NICs, and you had to have those 4 hosts. So then when we move to 9, hopefully you're getting used to this kind of architecture picture right now, or I guess block diagram as to how things have changed. So now we're asking you to deploy the VCF private cloud. And what is the VCF private cloud? Well, first of all, you have to deploy your first instance. Inside of that first instance, that becomes what we call your fleet. So that's your centralized location where you can deploy automation, you can deploy operations, and that really gives you everything that you need to start to manage that first instance and all of the other instances that you might deploy. This is kind of your central hub of what you need. Operations from the build out, from the deployment, from the management of all of the infrastructure that you're deploying, and then automation so that you can provide those services that you've seen during the week on top of that for your customer, for your tenants, for your customers. So that's what we call a fleet. So that's the top level entities, and they're obviously deployed in that first VCF instance. So you're still going to need that virtual center server, SDDC manager, NSX manager, NSX, operations fleet manager to enable the lifecycle management, and operations collector. So there's a few changes here, as you can see from the previous diagram. First of all, we've brought out VCF Installer. I'm sure you've seen a lot of information about that this week. There's been some great sessions. If you didn't catch them, make sure you go and watch those. They take you through the deployment of VCF and the kind of import scenarios that you have as well. And VCF Installer is great because it kind of decoupled those software binaries from the actual appliance itself. So now you can download those in an online depot or an offline depot and actually provide those to the VCF installer. You now need 2 to 3 ESX hosts based on the storage that you want to use. And the great thing about this is on the previous slide, you'll have seen you needed 3 NSX managers. Now you can get away with deploying one NSX manager. So it's kind of reduced in size a little bit there as well.
Basically simplifies, and so instead of having all these cluster solutions, you actually start out small, right? And like Alan said, now you can only have 3 hosts as a minimum, and if you're using external storage, we do support other primary storage types, and so if you're using things like NFS, you only need 2 hosts. So again, a lot more flexibility, as you can see from 9, and even on the networking, you can see here, I only show 1 NIC. So you can actually start small and then over time grow that. And again, you probably won't do this in production, but this is great for the use cases that we have talked about, especially from a minimal footprint standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, let's face it, you probably don't care about things like HA and DRS maybe when you're deploying it in a lab environment or in a home environment and you're just learning. You just want the core features that are deployed. Like William said, that's the smallest versions that you want to deploy. Get it out there, test a few things out. I don't know, maybe you do want HA, maybe you want to test out things like that as well, and that's where you can start adding, obviously. Okay, so everybody familiar now with what it takes to actually get 9 deployed. So that minimal VCF deployment really comes down to, as we said, the private cloud, the fleet with these in here, and then if you want to use vSAN, you will need at least 2 ESX hosts and the gigabit network. 10 gig network, no, 1 gig network,
1 gig.
sorry. 1 gig. We'll go through the tips in a minute. I'm ahead of myself. Okay, so We also have the additional components. Don't stop at just the core components, obviously. A lot of the times people want to deploy those additional components to learn about the things that they don't currently have in production as well. Maybe test those out, see if they're relevant for what they want to do at work and bring them into those production environments. You know, test out the latest in containers and load balancing and networking, get familiar with those things before you actually start to deploy those in production. So we talked about that, but what are the actual resource requirements? So this is the current size of a minimal deployment in VCF 9.0. And I want to just do a quick raise of hands. We kind of talked about the fact that all of this is needed. And William and I were having a discussion about the type of hardware that's going to be used in a home lab. William's going to go through that in a moment. But just quick raise of hands. Who here has a POC or a minimal deployment use case that doesn't have 24 vCPUs? So everybody apart from one person has 24 vCPUs in their POC servers and their home labs. Like 24 is not a problem. I should say a single processor with 24 cores, not an aggregate 24 cores, by the way. So you're talking about dual 16, which makes 24. I'm talking about a single 24 CPU. So does that alter the perception? Anybody not able to support a single 24 CPU? Now the hands go up. Got it. Thank you for clarifying.
Actually, out of curiosity, what's the maximum number of vCPUs you can provision with the hardware that you would like to use today to deploy VCF 9? 12? Anything higher? 48?
Any more bids?
128? Okay.
148, you got a large environment.
In aggregate.
No, per single VM.
Single CPU.
Yeah.
4. Wow. Yeah, because you were talking about the mobile use case. Yeah. Gotcha.
Okay. That's good to know.
Thank you. That's great. And then obviously what we've listed below as well is it's not just about the fact that we need these appliances deployed. You've also got to think about things like the DNS server. Where's that coming from? The NTP server, HTTPS server for hosting that offline depot and the components. And then you've got to think about the networking as well. What do you need for that? You need that networking switch that supports the VLANs, that's able to get all of this stuff talking together and for you to be able to deploy these. So when you think about that minimal deployment, this is exactly kind of what you need to get up and running and get it out there. But what are the hardware trends, William? What can we start to use to deploy our minimal deployments?
Yep. Yeah. And as we kind of go through the session, when we talk about the minimal deployment, it's not just standing up VCF 9. That's interesting for those that want to play with it. But the point here is that you're able to stand it up and literally play with all the different capabilities that VCF 9 has to offer. So all the things you're hearing about networking, storage, some of the add-on services will be possible with this particular configuration. So just keep that in mind. Before I kind of jump into some hardware, it's good to just baseline a little bit and just to kind of understand where the hardware trends have been happening and what's been happening in the industry from a CPU and memory standpoint, which typically becomes a big driver for a lot of these hardware purchases. So we take a look at typically historically for the longest time, Intel, AMD CPUs, you typically have a performance processor, right? And within this processor, typically you have something called like hyper-threading or symmetric multiprocessing, right? And that's been the trend for the longest time, right? And kind of starting in 2021, 2022, Intel, and this is specifically for consumer processors, there have been some changes in the enterprise, but not as dramatic, right? And so in 2021, Intel changed the consumer architecture to have sort of this non-uniformity. They would continue to have these performance cores that have hyper-threading, but they introduced this new efficiency core, right? And so now your workload could potentially be on a P core or potentially E-core. And this creates non-uniformity. Now, from a ESX standpoint, we don't see this in the data center. And so obviously, by default, the VM kernel will say, I don't know how to process these because these are two different CPU capabilities. They're not equal, right? And so for consistency purposes, the system will basically PSOD, and that's by design. There are ways to override that, as you've seen, but this is an architecture that they brought forth in the consumer space. Now, they changed it again in around 2023 with their 14th generation processors. And again, this is specifically for Intel. They introduced a third core type called low power efficiency. So now on a single host or a single processor, you now have 3 different types of cores, right? And so if you run a workload, can you imagine it landing on an efficiency core, low power core? And these low power cores are like sub 1 gigahertz. Right, so huge amounts of difference and huge amounts of capability differences. And so you can imagine if you're running workloads here, there are going to be some challenges if you're looking for that consistent performance aspect of it. And then in 2024, the architecture changed one more time. And if you look at it, they actually went away from these hyper-threading cores, right? Intel kind of pioneered this, but now they're kind of taking that away. And so now we still have these 3 different core types, but now for the performance cores, you no longer have hyper-threading. Now, early on when we just had 2 types, one of the options that you had as a consumer of these hardware is you can actually go into the BIOS setting and actually disable the E cores, right? That way it will behave just like what the system used to behave. But with these new architectures, you don't have the ability to disable these low power E cores. And so you're always going to have this non-uniformity, which again creates a challenge if you're trying to run workloads and have consistent performance and ultimately behaviors in the system. Now, while all of this was happening, I would say that AMD has been doing some really interesting things here, not only in the data center, but also in the consumer space. They've been doing a lot of these Ryzen, Zen types of CPUs, but especially with the rise of AI, they've got some really interesting processors, kind of codename Ryzen AI, and they have a whole slew of things, but they basically have these Zen 5 cores. And interestingly, while these are 2 different core types, the Zen 5C has the same microarchitecture as the Zen 5 cores, which means that it's the same capabilities, same instruction set. It's just optimized for efficiency processes standpoint. And so from a VMware standpoint, EXX sees these as just consistent and uniform cores. And so it behaves as expected. And interestingly, there are some pretty nice high core counts. So you'll see some of these in the 12 to 16 CB processor cores, and then up to 32 to 24 threads, right, for these systems. And so they kind of maintain this symmetric multiprocessing thread. And so that's been really interesting, and you'll kind of see why in a second. And there's been some rumors, that later on in the years, Intel may potentially kind of go back to its original architecture. So I think the optimization here in terms of having efficiency running on mobile devices, right? Really just to have these systems be low power core may or may not have the benefits that they were hoping for. And so there are some rumors that, they potentially may go back in time and kind of bring back the original architecture. So it's something to be aware of as you're looking at the hardware that you have today. You might span some of these, or if you're looking at purchasing, just be aware of these things because it may not be immediately clear from the consumer hardware standpoint. Memory tends to be a huge, challenge for a lot of folks, right? That tends to be the first resource that goes away. VCF9 loves a lot of memory, and for good reasons, right? And we want to be able to meet that, right? And early on, especially for a lot of these small form factor systems, they typically take these SODIMM memory. These are laptop-based memory. And if you look at it, right, early days in 2019, we were able to get to basically 64 gigs of memory maximum, right? So these systems typically have 2 slots. And at the time, if you look back then, it was about $300 US. Right now, if you were to buy the same configuration, and this is probably out of date, it's about $186. So you can kind of see where the pricing has gone now. 2023, we did a big architectural shift. You'll see here, these are DDR4. And that's been around for quite some time. In fact, you hear from a lot of manufacturers like Samsung that they're going to stop producing DDR4 type memory and kind of switch over to DDR5, which is a new architecture. So these are not swappable. So these are typically going to require new hardware and obviously new memory modules. But what's cool here is that we introduced these non-binary memory DIMMs, and now you can actually get 2 48 gigabyte DDR5 modules. So that means you can get up to 96 gigs of memory. And interestingly, if you look at the price point right there, it's $300. So you can see, a jump in terms of what you're getting, and now it's roughly under $200 if you were to purchase it right now. More recently, in 2025, actually start of this year, again, more innovation happening in the memory space for consumer. You now have 64 gig DIMM modules. So now on a single small platform, I can actually get up to 128 gigabytes of memory. So just imagine kind of how far we've jumped, in the early days where it's like, hey, 32 gig, 64 gig was really great. We can now get quite a bit high. And even in the pricing standpoint, you can see it's already dropping quite significantly. And I'm pretty sure that these prices are probably out of date, but just something to be aware of. As we talk about memory, we talk about AMD systems, a lot of it is really powering the AI revolution that's happening right now. Even in the consumer space, everybody's wanting to run and play with it. There is a difference between sort of standard DDR5 versus LP DDR5, and the difference there is anytime you see LP DDR5, these are soldered on memory. And typically it has higher bandwidth, really catering again to the AI use case, but these are non-configurable memory modules. And so if you purchase a system, you kind of have to pick your capacity of memory. Typically, again, it goes up to 128 gigs of memory, but they are going to be a little bit more expensive because this is soldered on memory, typically higher bandwidth for use cases like AI, et cetera. Okay, now we're going to kind of jump into sort of a reference implementation. This is something that we're using for some of the hands-on labs. I know a lot of folks have read one of my blog posts, just deploying it, but this is just an example of it. Obviously, there's a lot of options out there. I've got a number of resources that I've been collecting over the years, not only for VCF 5.x, but also for 9.x. Since we just launched and GA'd, VCF 9, a lot of customers have been deploying 9.0 on a variety of different hardware. Some a little bit older, some a little bit newer. And so I've got a lot of these articles allowing folks to basically contribute. And if you kind of take a look at that first website right here, you can take a look at what hardware has been configured, what drivers, what firmware works and possible. And if you've deployed it, feel free to also contribute back. So that way you can kind of see what's possible before you make a commitment. Now, specifically, we're going to talk about this particular configuration. And again, we're talking about the hardware requirements. You may have other systems very similar to that, but if you're looking for net new hardware, the slide that Alan had talked about earlier, where there are going to be an increased vCPU requirement, that's probably, for most of you, you're probably going to have to do some level of investment. And so if you're just looking for something, this is just one option there. So there's a small little startup called Mini Forms, and they have this really cool kit. It's called an MSA2. It supports both a Zen 4, which is sort of the last generation. Currently, they're at the Zen 5, but in terms of capability-wise, it's 16 cores, 32 threads. And you heard earlier we talked about, the sort of the high bar in terms of deploying VCF 9 is the VCF automation component, which does require 24 vCPUs. So you can see here, we're well within that limit, right? You actually have 32 threads, so I can actually create a virtual machine that goes up to 32 threads, and these are high-end cores. It supports 2 SODIMM memory modules, so each of these physical systems can hold 120 gigs of DRAM, and I'll talk about what else you can do with that. There's multiple NVMe slots, so you can do local VMFS, vSAN OSA, vSAN ESA, NVMe tiering. It's got all those capabilities and even supports U.2. And so you can even do things like NVMe namespaces. So if you buy some of the higher end NVMe devices, I can actually carve up a single device and have multiple slices of that for a number of different things. So if you want to play with different types of architecture, you can as well from a storage standpoint. It's got 2 2.5 gigabit NICs. One is Intel, so works perfectly fine with ESX8, ESX9. The other one is Realtek. Realtek does not have drivers for ESXi, so that's not going to be usable in the system. And interesting, it's also got dual 10 gigabits SFP plus modules. So I can actually use that for vSAN configuration, fully supported in terms of a network driver standpoint. And then obviously we're using different memory drives, 500 gigs for the ESX installation, the ESX OS data, and you can actually lay down a VMFS volume, and you'll see that when we talk about the installation process. The 1 terabyte memory is going to be used for NVMe tiering. Again, these are references. It doesn't have to be the exact capacity, but I'm just giving myself a buffer space. And then we're using the 2 terabyte memory for basically the entire VCF deployment and all for your workloads altogether. And then we're also using a MikroTik 5-port 10 gigabit switch. So it's got full VLANs capability, BGP, all those configurations. So it allows you to play with a lot of cool NSX capabilities, right? So kind of the starting point here.
Okay, so we've been through the deployment that you need for VCF 9. What are the components you need to deploy? How do you get up and running? We've been through the hardware that you might deploy it on, but this wouldn't be a good session unless we had some of William's tips and tricks in here as to how you can really cut the corners and minimize this thing and get it down to something that you can use. So let's go through a few tips and tricks that we've come up with that will help you actually reduce that a little bit more and get you down to what you need and find ways around things that are not necessarily supported, but work. So the minimum ESX host requirement, we spoke about this a moment ago. For vSAN and Fiber channel, it's 3 ESX hosts. NFS storage, we can get that down to 2. But you got any more tips for us, William?
Yeah, we can definitely do a little bit better than that, especially if you have a bigger host. We do have the ability, and there's this nice little configuration flag that you can install into the VCF installer that allows you to actually deploy the full VCF 9 stack on a single physical host. And so just by adding this parameter, it will go ahead and just sort of bypass the minimum requirements. Again, please do not do this in production, but for lab testing purposes and all that. And if you would like this feature, by the way, we have a product manager that might want to hear that feedback as well after the class, but this is one way you can actually apply a parameter that will override that requirement.
Thank you, great start. And then for the NICs, this is one that I hit all the time. So do I need that 10 gig NIC?
No.
Okay, good.
But I will say, if you are going to be doing things like networking, vSAN, it's definitely good to have that, and it's there for a reason. But not everybody has access to a 10 gigabit NIC. Maybe you might have 5 gigabits, 2.5 gigabits. If you're doing maybe NFS or fiber channel for that matter, you probably don't need all that networking, right? And so we do have another override where we can say, hey, we know the requirement, let's go and just bypass that. And so here's another parameter that you can add to the VCF installer that will basically disable the pre-check. Is this something that would be useful for you, especially from a networking standpoint? Okay, cool, awesome.
Okay. And then
I'm just breaking the product left and right now.
I know, that's what you're here for, come on. And with vSAN, so yeah, I mean, obviously we don't go and test each one of these equipments that you throw up on your blog. So how can we get past that HCL requirement?
All right. Who here is interested in deploying vSAN ESA? Oh, awesome. Yeah, there's like really a lot of cool capabilities. Who can deploy vSAN ESA today with your hardware? Yeah, okay. Oh, okay, that's good. Yeah, so today, especially from a VCF installer standpoint, obviously we want you to have a good experience, especially if you're really pushing it. So by default, the system's gonna check against the ESA HCL and say, nope, we're gonna not allow you to proceed. But we do have a mechanism to basically bypass that. And there is this mock VIB that you can install onto the ESXi host that basically says, nope, the system is certified. Go ahead and allow the installer to proceed forward. So again, please don't do this in production. I will get calls from legal and support, but it's a great way to play with ESA, especially from a functional standpoint, going through the workflows. And again, so here's another parameter that you can install onto the host itself. And then once you restart one of the services, the VCF install will see this host as basically certified.
Okay, next up. Sometimes you can't even get started because I don't have that offline depot that has a cert installed, and I don't want to have the additional cost of going out and buying a cert.
Yeah, I mean, creating a cert is not too difficult, but it's another barrier to entry, right? And so it's really easy to download the software using this new download tool, and then you put that into an installer. But if you don't want to have a certificate, there is another override where you can basically serve it over HTTP. So again, here's a parameter where we're basically disabling the HTTPS requirement. And if you're doing this within your lab environment, hopefully you trust your network, right? And so again, this just reduced the barrier to entry if you want to just get started. Download software bits, host it on a web server, which is still a requirement, but at least I don't have to deploy a certificate in that environment for that configuration.
And speaking of that web server, I obviously have to have one. So I have to spin up something else.
So I know you're a product manager, you forgot how to install a web server. Okay, fine. Okay, so you're right. For production requirements, you would deploy a web server, right? Because ultimately that's how the VCF installer is talking to the software depot. But there's really cool content out there. And so even in Python, there's modules that basically can provide really basic web server-like experience. And so here, what you see here is just this little script. And if you just search this on my blog, it's got the full details. But what I can do is I can download the software. And using this little script, I can actually bind it and basically use my laptop or some system to act as this web server endpoint. And so my VCF installer can basically point to the content. Once it pulls it down, you don't need this. And so this is actually great for consultants who are downloading all that software, going into like an air gap environment. I don't need a certificate. I can stand up, basically a web server just using Python. There's no other dependency. And this is something that I do all the time to really simplify just standing up the infrastructure. Because once you have all the software downloaded into your infrastructure, you don't need it again unless you plan on redeploying. So this is a really quick way where I'm just taking the directory structure and just saying, run this command. It basically acts. And so if you open a browser to this address, you'll see the content as if you deployed a web server. Perfect for somebody like you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Okay, so we've been through what we need. We've been through the components. We know what hardware to install it on. We've got some great tips and tricks. We can probably get up and running now. But why don't you bring it home and take us through what that step-by-step looks like to make it super clear for everybody?
Yeah, no, sounds good. So now I'm going to walk you through, that minimum reference architecture that I showed you and kind of do a high-level step-by-step. And again, this is all documented into a GitHub repo. So I'll give you the links to this after the fact and you kind of follow along. And I also wrote a lot of automation just to make it simple for you. So while you can do this from a manual standpoint, I've automated most of the steps. So it should allow you to quickly get it started if you've got all the prerequisites, usually under a couple of hours.
A quick question on that, actually. How many of you actually automate the deployment of your VCF rollouts via VCF installer or with the JSON or? Yeah, okay. Most of you go through and manually deploy them each time, is what I'm seeing. I didn't see many hands go up for automation.
Or is your intention to automate once you kind of understand VCF 9?
Okay.
Yeah, okay, there we go. Yeah.
Because that's what's in prod, then we can automate
native once we're comfortable with it.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And there's a lot of goodness that's in the installer, by the way, to actually make that even simpler. So I can actually touch upon that a little bit since I know a lot of folks are still new to VCF in general. So I'm just kind of putting up this architecture diagram again. This is not using any nested virtualization at all. You know, there are different solutions out there from Broadcom. Anybody use Holodeck? Cool, awesome. It's a great solution. You know, it's a single host solution, but you do need some amount of requirements, right? Because it's deploying everything nested and then it goes and deploys that. But it's really great because it's air gapped, it's got virtual networking in there. But if you really want to deploy it like production and kind of get hands-on with physical, and that's something that I've been doing a lot of, especially exploring things with like NSX VPC and just kind of going through that workflow. This is a great example. And so there's no nested virtualization used in the solution at all. You're literally deploying VCF9 as if you're doing it in production. So something to be cognizant of, especially if that's something that you're interested in trying out. So
Sorry, one more thing. I forgot to mention this earlier, but I'm assuming everybody is aware of the hands-on labs as well. You don't just have to go in there and follow the instructions, you know. You can just spin up a VCF9 hands-on lab that has everything pre-created, and you can go and use those as well. Go off piece, go do your own thing once it's deployed. Don't follow the instructions. I do that all the time. If it's a quick thing that I need to learn or understand how it works, I'll just spin up HOL and I'll go through the steps and I'll understand how it works. And then I'll just let that HOL die. So just make sure you're all aware of that, because sometimes, you don't want to spend all this money to get to that point where you have all of this just to prove out what something looks like or how it works. So make use of that resource as well.
Yeah.
Sorry, William.
No, good point. So we'll start with two reference hosts. These are single NIC. I've got 3 NVMe drives. I'm going to do vSAN ESA. I'm also going to use NVMe tiering. And how many of you guys heard of NVMe tiering? Fantastic. It's a great feature, right? For those of you not familiar, there's a technology we launched in 8.0 as a tech preview. It is now officially GA 9.0. And one of the really cool things is I can take this host that can max out at 120 gigs of DRAM. And just by using an NVMe device, right, I can turn on this NVMe tiering capability, and it has like a 1-to-4 ratio. So in the best case, I can actually get 4x the memory. Right now, I'm just doing 100%. What that means is that 120 gigs of DRAM, once I turn on NVMe tiering, now I have 256 gigs of available memory that I can use for the system for all sorts of types of workloads. So lots of really cool things that you can now do in terms of, and this is just simply deploying the software, right? So I got those drives there. I'm gonna obviously use vSAN ESA, right? But you have your choice of your storage type. And then we'll deploy, obviously the full fleet aspect of it, and then we'll talk about what else can you do with this deployment. So here I'm just representing a single host, but you would obviously do this for the secondary host, or if you wanted to do 3. But I've got 3 NVMe drives here, complete blank slate, and I'm going to install using USB. So here I'm going to basically put ESX 9.0 onto the USB device. And typically you would just do the next install. I'm sure all of you guys have gone through that screen. I have written an embedded kickstart, which is on the repo that will automatically install ESX for you. Set up the ESX OS data on that first NVMe device, and then also configure local VMFS storage, right? So we can actually use that for some workloads. And then obviously for the second device there, you can see in green, enabling the NVMe tiering capability. And you can even create custom menus, and that's actually what I've done recently. So these are custom EFI menus, and so you can actually set this up and make it very easy for you to install different hosts for reinstallation. Again, that's also in the blog post that has all the content for setting that up. Second step, we're then going to go deploy this new VCF installer, right? So it's no longer that monolithic cloud builder appliance that you're used to downloading. It's this very lightweight installer. And since we have local VMFS, we can actually use that exact same host to host it, where historically you would typically deploy that outside of your VCF 5.x environment. It might be running on a separate ESXi host. We can actually leverage the exact same infrastructure here. And Alan mentioned DNS earlier. If you've been to the hands-on lab, there's 3 of these kits actually running some of the setup there. And we wanted to make sure that everything was air-gapped. So we actually have a local DNS server running on that host. So you don't even need external infrastructure. So if you need things like NTP, I deploy my ESX host, I deploy the installer, I can predefine all those DNS requirements and actually deploy a DNS VM. And that's actually what we did for the hands-on lab for that particular configuration there. So you can run this in a sort of air-gap, isolated environment. Once the installer is deployed, obviously we need to connect to the offline depot. So like I mentioned earlier, you do have 2 options to connect to VCF's software depot. One is if you have a download token, you can generate the token from Broadcom's website, plug that into the VCF installer, and it'll automatically pull down all the software binaries and all the metadata. That's sort of the easy way of doing it, right? But you're going to need to do this each and every single time. If you're, refreshing, if every time you deploy the new VCF installer, you would have to pull that down. So it's probably in your interest to set up an offline depot, right? You don't have to pull down 55 gigabytes of storage each time because you might want to redeploy this environment, but it makes it very easy for you to stage those binaries. So however you get your offline depot set up, whether it's online or offline, we go ahead and take that VCF installer that we just deployed, and in the UI, we basically just connect it up there. Once it's pulled down all the binaries, I don't need that offline depot anymore, right? So if I was doing the offline depot on my laptop, right, I just stop the Python script, the VCF installer has all the software I need, and I'm ready to start deploying. Now, the VCF installer has this really fantastic UI that kind of walks you through the deployment. And one of the very nice thing about it is that right before you click go, you can actually export that deployment as a JSON file. And this is really good for source control the configuration, but then I can also use it for future deployments. If I want to play with stretch clustering, one of the things in the UI that we built is we allow you to deploy these appliances both in singleton model and clustered. So for example, I can deploy NSX with one node, or I can deploy NSX in 3 nodes. Now, you may want to do that for different components. So for example, I might want NSX Manager to have 3 nodes for high availability, but maybe for VCF automation, I want to have a single node. The UI doesn't allow for that, but the underlying JSON and the underlying implementation, we allow for that. So what you can do is you can kind of go through a full HA scenario, export that JSON, remove some parameters, add some parameters, and actually load that JSON back into the VCF installer, and now it'll deploy a very customized version, and we officially support that, by the way, right? So that's something that you may not have heard of, or maybe we haven't talked a whole lot about. And unlike the Cloud Builder, which also had this JSON experience, once you plug that JSON back into the system, it does a validation and just goes. With the new VCF installer, you can actually take this JSON, plug it back in. You can still do the old behavior, which is click go and go deploy, but there's an additional option where you can say edit in the wizard, and it basically reads that JSON and loads everything in the UI. So then you can kind of go back to the UI to say, oh, is this exactly what I wanted, or do I want to tweak some stuff? So we try to make it really, really easy for you to really simplify and automate that. So while we do have APIs where you can just press and go, it's very simple to basically use the UI and still have sort of a better experience than the old mechanism. So something to be aware of there. So we got the installer, we go and export the JSON. And again, I have a JSON example, so you can kind of take a look at what that is. But like I said, it's very easy to go through an interactive session from there. And then once you kind of click go, it's done the validation, starts deployment, what you'll see here is obviously that third disk now gets converted to a vSAN ESA data store, right? So the installer is going and now starting your VCF9 deployment. And at this point, you're not really doing any more manual intervention because this VCF JSON, this JSON file, codifies your entire VCF9 fleet deployment, right? That's one of the big change when you look at prior versions of VCF where you had to do the Cloud Builder, then you got to the SDC Manager, you had to go to the VRLCM, so all these different components. So that's a big part of the unification of the story. Now, obviously here we've got a single node that's being stood up, and it's going to go and deploy vCenter Server as the next component. So it's crafting that VCF management domain that Ellen talked about. Life is good, vCenter goes up, and then in a bit, you'll see an error in the VCF installer. Now, you will only see this if you're using less than 3 hosts and vSAN ESA. And the reason for that is by default, because we're using vSAN ESA, we're going to deploy an optimized VM storage policy, right? Basically a RAID 1 configuration. Now, if I only got 2 hosts or I've got 1 host, we're not able to achieve that availability. So when it goes and tries to deploy NSX Manager, it's going to say, nope, I can't configure the policy. The policy is not meeting the desired state. So you'll see an error in the installer. That's expected. All you have to do is basically log into that vCenter server. It's already deployed, right? And basically modify the VM storage policy. So I said this is only needed if you have less than 3 hosts and you're using vSAN ESA, all right? So you've got a single node. You can deploy the whole VCF9 fleet, but there is this one intervention point that you do need to be aware of, right? So you go ahead, apply that change, go back to the VCF installer. You just click retry. You don't need to redo anything, right? So you click retry, installer is happy, and it goes in and starts the configuration. Now, this VCF installer, I won't go too deep into it, but the VCF installer can actually behave in 2 different personalities. The default behavior is that once it's got those binary, it's going to transition itself into SDC Manager, which is a component that's responsible for multi-vCenter lifecycle management. That's a default behavior because you do need this component when you deploy the full VCF9 stack. Now, alternatively, I could have this VCF installer just stay an installer. So there is an override parameter when you go deploy this in the JSON, and I do have this document on my blog that basically says, nope, Don't be SCDC manager, just become an installer. And this is useful because you have all the binaries downloaded. You might want to redeploy multiple environments, right? And so you don't have to go through this whole workflow, because once it becomes SCDC manager and you need to redeploy, now you got to deploy another VCF installer. You got to download the binaries again, right? So depending on use case, the system is very flexible. So depending on what outcome you want, but if you don't do anything specifically, the installer is magically going to basically get storage vMotion into that vSAN ESA cluster, and it's basically going to take the personality of the SCDC manager component. We continue deploying NSX comes next, nothing magical there. We then deploy the new VCF operations fleet manager. So this is that component that's responsible for the lifecycle management of things like operations, operations collector, as well as VCF automation, right? So similarly, SCDC manager is responsible for the software-defined components, vCenter, the ESXi host, NSX, vSAN. This particular appliance is now responsible for those functions. Once that's deployed, it's going to go ahead and deploy VCF operations, the collector, and then finally VCF automation, right? So depending on your hardware capabilities, the speed, number of hosts, this varied. It can be about a couple of hours time, and then now you have a full VCF 9 fully configured and deployed. And at the end of the installer, basically this is what it looks like, right? So you do have an interactive flow. I doubt anybody's going to sit there and watch it, but if you're interested, you can see the different tasks, and automatically you'll have a link to the new VCF operations console, which is sort of that new interface that I'm sure you heard a lot about with all the new fleet management capabilities. So hopefully that was pretty straightforward, right? Not a whole lot of tweaking there. And that's really by design, right? We really want this to be easy for you to deploy. Now, obviously, I've given you a little bit additional tips and tricks to try to reduce the barrier to entry, but you can see here, that's it. Not a whole lot. And I've already provided a lot of the automation there. But it is kind of interesting because we talked about the deployment, right? And I do want to, circle back in terms of what you get from there, because I want the takeaway to not be, I can deploy VCF 9. That's not that interesting, right? It's how I use VCF 9, what are all the new cool features, MVME tiering, VPCs, Kubernetes, maybe some of the new data services. What is it? Private AI is now part of VCF. Yep. So now if you're interested in playing with AI, you now have the ability to do so. And this is a sort of a screenshot of that, right? And really the point here is that there is no feature. Let me repeat that again. There is no feature in our VCF 9.0 product component capabilities that you cannot do with something like a minimal deployment. Now, again, this is one specific reference implementation, but any similar types of hardware capabilities, you can see here. I can play with NSX VPCs, AVI load balancing, some of the supervisor capabilities, right? Not only deploying Kubernetes, but I can actually deploy modern workloads like virtual machines using Kubernetes style manifests. I can deploy some of the data services. I've been playing with DSM quite a bit lately. If you want to play with SQL Server, I can actually use that. And there's really nothing that you cannot do today, right? And so the point here is it's not about just deploying the stack. We want you to find value and really learn from it. And so this is a really easy way to get those capabilities.
It's all unlocked with the 90-day trial.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good point. So when you download the software, one of the big changes we did was we actually extended the evaluation period. So typically the product evaluation is 60 days. Now it's actually 90 days. So when you install it, you have 90 days, all features unlocked, right? And obviously if you want to play with some of the add-ons, you're going to either have to have a trial edition or have an entitlement, right? So most customers have those things. But you can see here, like I can play with all those core capabilities. And if you've got powerful enough hardware, I can even do a single node, right? But all of these systems can be played with, lots of interesting capabilities, right? And the point here is just making it easy for you to deploy. And there is a QR code that goes to my GitHub repo that documents all of this in much more greater detail.
Yeah, if you take a picture of anything, take a picture of this slide, because that goes through probably a little bit slower than what we've gone through today. Gives you all the information that you need to be able to replicate this and deploy this out there. So we'll leave it on this slide. We are 2 minutes left, so we're happy to take any questions. I'd like to encourage you to come to the microphone if you can. If you don't feel like it, I'll point at people, shout it out, and I'll repeat the question. Yeah, I saw your hand go up first.
So do you guys have the minimums published?
Do we have the minimums published?
Yes, it's in our official, tech, Broadcom tech docs. It is documented for both singleton and hybrid. No, you're talking about the configuration maximums.
What I'm trying to do, so I'm a provider, so I have like a private light, so I need to know the minimum number.
Yeah.
Okay.
Without VSAN, blah, 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 that I need to do.
Yep.
That's 45.
Right.
And it's been hard to find finding that.
Okay.
So I'm just curious if that.
It's definitely documented. I've also had a hard time finding it too, but it's definitely on the documentation. It's in the official Broadcom documentation. Sorry?
The VCF documentation's 8100 or something.
Yeah.
So,
We'll definitely take that back as feedback, but it's definitely there officially. Yeah. Yep.
And I believe, I know it's not the official documentation, but you have a blog post that actually lists all this.
Yeah, I
out
also have
as
a blog
well.
post that talks about the minimum. It's the same exact minimum. It's not like these are special minimums for non-supported. Like we support this officially as production.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Yep.
So, someone here this week that we requested we have to read through all the VCF documents correctly, that the documentation's like in a dark mode.
Dark mode. Who would like dark mode for documentation? Yeah, I would as well. It's fantastic. It's funny you mentioned that. So part of the organizations, I'm part of the VCF division, just like Alan. My boss actually runs our documentation team now. So we had a sort of slight reorg. So it's hopefully easier for me to provide feedback. And so I'll definitely take the dark mode requirement as well as the easier to find the minimums back as feedback. Those are things that we can definitely improve upon. Yeah. Yeah.
try to minimize the cost differently about $1,000.
Oh, good question. Yeah, so for one of these systems, it ultimately depends on what hardware you've got, because a lot of times you might have some of these components like storage devices, networking. All said and done, roughly it's about around $1,000 for one of these systems. So if you want two of these, it's roughly about $2,000, not counting the switch. Yeah.
Change that would make it a lot easier. Which change would you
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, no, we looked at the minimal configuration. I think now, especially playing with a lot of these features, I'm really playing a lot with VCF automation. There's some really cool stuff there, especially the multi-tenancy. What I'm finding is I'm just turning on all these features. In an ideal world, get 3 hosts, save yourself some time. While we have all these overrides, you can do all these hacks. If you care about the data coming back online when it powers on, because one of the other things that I did run into is with the 2-node with vSAN ESA is that when it comes back online, HA gets a little bit confused, right? And so what you have to do is actually disable vSphere HA, turn it back on, and the supervisor VM will actually power itself back on. So there are some of these like little quirks that you might find. And so if you absolutely need to run minimal, it's there. But if you ask my personal recommendation, in fact, I just bought one recently to finish off the 3 nodes, is get at least 3 nodes. Save yourself some headache, and it gives you a buffer room. Because like I said, it's not about deploying the stack. It's about actually using the capabilities in there. Great question.
Okay, I think we're out of time now, so sorry we can't take your questions. We will hang out outside of the room for a little while. I want to thank you all for coming, first of all.
Please fill out your surveys.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Fill out your survey.